It is close to midnight on the 24th of October, 1944, in the shallow strait between Formosa and the China coast, and the American submarine Tang has just had the best night of the entire war. On the surface in the dark, she has torn a Japanese convoy apart, and now, with 2 torpedoes left, her captain lines up on a crippled transport and fires the 23rd. It runs straight and true. He fires the 24th, his last, and this one, the last torpedo of the deadliest submarine in the United States Navy, breaks from its course, curves hard to the left, and turns in a tight circle back toward the boat that launched it. The captain has perhaps 10 seconds. He shouts for emergency speed. It is not enough. The Tang is about to be sunk by her own weapon, with her own crew aboard, and the man on her bridge is about to lose everything. Exactly 1 year after the sea took the man who taught him how to do all of this. If true, forgotten stories of the men who fought this war are what you came for, take a second and subscribe, because this one has been quiet for 80 years. Now, back to the strait and to the 2 men at the heart of it, because to understand the night the Tang killed herself, you have to go back to a different submarine, and to the fearless, troubling captain who trained the best submariner America ever produced. One thing has to be said first. These men were real, and their boats were real, and what happened to both is documented in the Navy's own war patrol reports, and in the captain's own memoirs written after the war. Dudley Morton, called Mush, commanded the submarine Wahoo. Richard O'Kane, called Dick, was his executive officer and later commanded the Tang. The sinking of the Tang by her own torpedo is a matter of record. What is described here, the dark, the cold water, the feel of a steel hull going down, is drawn from the survivors' own accounts. The men were real. What happened to them was real. This is as close to it as the record allows. They belonged to a service the country barely saw. The submarines of the Pacific were the silent service, a few thousand men in steel tubes, who went out alone for weeks at a time, hunted the enemy's shipping across an ocean, and came back, or did not, with almost no one watching. The submarine force made up a tiny fraction of the Navy and suffered the highest loss rate of any American service in the war. 1 in 5 submariners who went out did not return. It was statistically the most dangerous job in the United States military, and the men who did it were volunteers. And the 2 best of them, for a brief and terrible stretch of the war, served on the same boat. Dudley "Mush" Morton was the most aggressive submarine captain in the Pacific, and possibly the most aggressive the Navy has ever had. When he took command of the Wahoo at the end of 1942, most American skippers were cautious, firing from a safe distance, breaking off when the odds turned. Morton did the opposite. He hunted on the surface, chased convoys into dangerous water, attacked things his training told him to avoid, and brought results back that no one else was getting. He had a gift for it, and a nerve that bordered on recklessness, and the men who served under him either worshipped him or feared him, and often both. He turned the Wahoo into the most famous submarine in the fleet, and he did it in a matter of months. His executive officer, his second in command, was a quiet, intense lieutenant commander named Dick O'Kane. Where Morton was all instinct and fire, O'Kane was precise, a perfectionist at the periscope and the torpedo data computer, and between them they made a team that was better than either man alone. Morton did something unusual. He let O'Kane run the attacks, standing back and giving his exec the con during the most dangerous moments, teaching by handing over the boat. O'Kane later wrote that he learned more from Morton in a few patrols than in all the years before. He was watching being trusted with the most lethal work on the boat, and he was becoming, under Morton's eye, something the Navy had not seen before. The record does not let us make Morton simple. On one patrol in early 1943, after sinking a troop transport, the Wahoo fired on Japanese survivors in the water, an act Morton defended as denying the enemy soldiers a return to the fight, and one that has been argued over ever since as a hard and troubling moment in an otherwise celebrated career. It belongs in the story because the truth belongs in the story. Morton was a great submarine captain and complicated man, and the war he fought was crueler than the legend around him. Both of those are true, and honoring the men means not flinching from either one. In the autumn of 1943, Morton took the Wahoo into the Sea of Japan, the enemy's home waters, a place few boats dared go. He sank ship after ship, and then sometime around the 11th of October, trying to slip back out through a narrow strait, the Wahoo was caught by enemy aircraft and sunk. There were no survivors. Mush Morton and every one of the roughly 80 men aboard were lost, and the most famous submarine in the fleet simply stopped answering. By then, Dick O'Kane was already gone from the Wahoo, given his own command. He had left the boat that killed his mentor only months before it went down. He would carry that for the rest of his life. O'Kane's boat was the Tang, brand new, and he ran her exactly the way Morton had taught him, aggressive, close, relentless, but with O'Kane's own precision layered on top of Morton's fire. The results were staggering. In 5 patrols, the Tang sank more enemy ships than any other American submarine of the war. O'Kane became the deadliest submarine commander the United States ever produced, and he did it in barely a year, applying on his own bridge every lesson he had learned, standing behind Mush Morton on the Wahoo. The student had become the master, and the boat that had trained him was already on the bottom of the Sea of Japan. He was not only a hunter. On one patrol, stationed off a heavily defended enemy base to rescue any aviators shot down in a big carrier airstrike, the Tang stayed on the surface under the enemy's guns, hour after hour, pulling down American pilots out of the water one after another. She rescued 22 aviators in a single day. More than any submarine had ever saved, young flyers who would have drowned or been captured brought aboard a submarine that refused to leave until the water was empty. It is the other side of O'Kane, and of the service, the same boat that sank so many ships risking everything, on the surface, in daylight, to save 24 strangers. By October 1944, the Tang was on her 5th patrol in the shallow, dangerous strait off the China coast. Watt and O'Kane was hunting the way Morton had taught him, on the surface at night, right in among the enemy convoys. For 2 nights, the Tang was devastating, sinking ship after ship at close range, so close that O'Kane could see men on the decks of the vessels he was destroying. On the last night, down to his final torpedoes, he lined up on one more crippled ship, determined to finish the patrol with an empty torpedo room and a full score. He fired the 23rd, and then he fired the 24th. The 24th torpedo malfunctioned the instant it left the tube. Instead of running straight, it broached, porpoised, and swung into a sharp circular run, curving back through the dark water toward the Tang. O'Kane, on the bridge, saw its phosphorescent wake bend toward him and understood in an instant what was happening. He ordered the boat thrown into an emergency turn at full power, trying to twist the long hull out of the path of his own weapon. The Tang was still swinging when the torpedo struck her in the stern and detonated. The deadliest submarine in the United States Navy had been killed by the last torpedo she ever fired. The men on the bridge, O'Kane among them, were thrown into the sea as the boat dropped from under them. Below, the Tang settled onto the bottom of the strait, about 180 feet down, with dozens of men trapped live inside her forward compartments in the dark, with the water risoing and the enemy on the surface above. Poured. What happened next, in the flooded steel of a sunken submarine on the seafloor, is one of the most harrowing survival stories eaten Tiwa, and it is true. And the men who lived it wrote it. In the forward torpedo room, the surviving crewmen did something almost no one had ever done successfully. Using a simple breathing device called the Momsen lung, they went one at a time into the escape trunk, flooded it, opened the hatch to the sea, and rose 180 feet through black water to the surface in the dark, with no guarantee that anything waited above but the enemy. A few made it, many did not. It was one of the only times in the war that men escaped from a submarine sunk on the bottom and lived. They came up out of the sea in the dark, gasping, into a strait still lit by their own burning victims, and found a handful of others from the bridge still alive in the water. Of the 87 men aboard the Tang, 9 would survive the night. They were pulled from the water by the enemy, and here the war closed its circle on them. The men who fished O'Kane and his survivors out of the sea were in part survivors themselves, sailors and passengers from the very ships the Tang had been sinking hour after hour on those same nights. They knew what this submarine had done to them, and they beat the Tang's men for it, on the deck of the ship, with a fury that O'Kane later said he understood even as it fell on him, because he had put those men in that water. It is the hardest kind of truth the war offers, that the cruelty ran in every direction, that the men beating him had lost everything to him, and that all of them, hunters and hunted, were young men caught in the same machine. O'Kane survived the beating, and survived the prison camp that followed, a brutal secret interrogation center, where captured submariners and aviators were starved and treated far from the eyes of the world. He was there for the better part of a year. By the time the war ended and the camps were opened, the deadliest submarine commander in the United States Navy weighed less than half of what he had, a gaunt grey ghost of the man who had taken the Tang to sea. He came home to a country that had counted him among the dead. He came home when Mush Morton and the 80 men of the Wahoo and 78 men of his own Tang did not. Richard O'Kane received the Medal of Honor for that last night in the strait, for fighting his boat brilliantly, and for the way he tried, in the final seconds, to save her from his own torpedo. He lived a long life, and he spent a great deal of it doing one thing above all others. He wrote it down. He wrote the full account of the Tang, and then he went back and wrote the of the Wahoo of Mush Morton, of the patrols where he had learned everything, determined that the man who taught him and the men who died with them would not be a footnote in someone else's history. The protege had outlived the mentor by decades. He used those decades to make sure the mentor was remembered. So there they are, the two of them, a year and an ocean apart. Mush Morton, the fearless, flawed fought under the sea, lost with all hands in the enemy's own waters, no grave but the boat. Dick O'Kane, the quiet perfectionist he trained, who became the best there ever was and was nearly killed by his own last shot, and who came back barely to carry both their stories. One of them the sea kept, one of them it gave back. And the one it gave back spent the rest of his life making sure the country knew what the one it kept had been. It is easy, with submarines, to think of tonnage and torpedoes and records, because that is what the reports counted. But the real story under the sea was always two men on a cramped bridge in the dark, one teaching and one learning, trusting each other with a boat and 80 lives, one teaching in the most dangerous work the country had to offer. Morton handed O'Kane the con so he could become the best. O'Kane became the best, and it cost him his boat and nearly his life, and it left him the keeper of the record for both of them. The lesson passed from one man to the other, and the price passed with it. That is what the silent service was. Not the numbers. The men and what they were willing to be for each other, in the dark, where no one could see. The Tang lies where she fell, in the strait off the China coast. The Wahoo lies in the cold water between Japan and the mainland, found at last many years later, her whole crew still aboard. 2 boats, 2 captains, one of whom trained the other, both taken by the war they had mastered better than anyone. The country gave O'Kane its highest medal and gave Morton its silence, and O'Kane spent his life trying to even that out, one written page at a time. He knew what the record forgets, and what it keeps. He had watched the sea take the best man he ever knew and give the credit to the student. So he wrote it down, all of it, and made the record tell the truth. Because someone who was there always has to, and the country just closes over them, and the country never learns what it had.